So welcome to our first part of our self-care series, Origins and Dynamics of Organizational Trauma. As I said, this presentation will be recorded and available on our YouTube page for any of you who want to watch it again or share with your staff in the future. Throughout the presentation today, if you do have questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to ask those in the chat or question box in the control panel that you will see on the right side of your screen. And we are going to go right ahead and jump in. So today we're going to be talking about organizational trauma. Just like people, organizations can experience trauma. They can experience trauma from single catastrophic events, ongoing harms and stresses, and by the very nature of working with victims and survivors of trauma. So today's workshop will explore how organizational trauma occurs, how it affects staff and individuals within an organization, and if we have time at the end, we may begin touching on what we can do to build resilience. The self-care series as a whole, if you are not aware, every Wednesday throughout the month of February, we will be having a webinar discussing some aspect of personal or organizational self-care. The series will explore individual and organizational resilience and how to create organizations that are healthy and survivor-centered, and how this ultimately enhances organizational stability and creates a stronger foundation for services to survivors over time. So the February 8th webinar, Creating Healthy Organizational Cultures Part 1, will be exploring how to start to heal a traumatized organization. In Healthy Organizational Cultures Part 2, we will start talking about how we can build self-care into an organization as part of the mission of your program and prevent trauma from occurring. And then in the February 22nd webinar, Vicarious Trauma and Self-Care in Individuals, we will be talking about how secondary trauma impacts our personal life and how we can incorporate self-care into multiple realms of our lives, not just at work. So that is what we will be doing throughout the month of February. If you would like to register for any of those additional webinars in this series and you have not done so already, you can view and register for those webinars at our website, tncoalition.org/calendar. So to start off, we're going to really define what organizational trauma is. And a great resource when I was creating this webinar in particular was the book Organizational Trauma and Healing by Pat Vivian and Shanna Horman. And in that publication, they say organizational trauma is a collective experience that overwhelms the organization's defensive and protective structures and leaves the entity temporarily vulnerable or permanently damaged. And so trauma can be things that are direct and acute. It can be things that are chronic stresses over time, so it may not be one acute incident, but smaller things that build up over time. Or it may be vicarious trauma created by the constant exposure to the violence and trauma that we work with every single day. In any of these forms, trauma seeps into victim services organizations and other caregiving organizations, and it affects not only those directly involved in the trauma, but the organization as a whole. The feeling, the structure, the culture of the organization is affected by these traumas. Unaddressed organizational trauma, whether it is a sudden acute trauma or whether it is chronic and cumulative, causes serious harm and can be organization ending. We have seen organizations around the country and around the state end because of unaddressed, untreated traumas within that organization that catastrophically impacted their ability to perform their work. It negatively impacts service delivery, compromises work with clients, and weakens the organization's ability to respond to both internal and external challenges. Over time, the unhealed effects of trauma and traumatization compromise the fundamental health of the organization, and that's why it's so important for us to be talking about this issue. We talk a lot about secondary trauma, traumatic stress, and self-care as it relates to an individual, but we don't have very often conversations about how these kind of negative, toxic stressors affect organizations as a whole. So that's really why we're having this conversation and why we're talking about it today. Especially in victim services and caregiving organizations like mental health, homelessness organizations, social services, domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, traumas can often manifest in the organization being stuck in a repetitive cycle of negativity, where trauma becomes this sort of underlying disease that presents as, you know, changes happening in negative ways where we are having turnover, or it's happening in predictable ways where we get new grants or new clients, but there's no sense of moving forward or moving past the trauma and negativity. So there's still this feeling of stuckness, of being stuck in this negative place, even as things are changing around you. And this happens when the system of the organization is so overwhelmed that it's not capable to bounce back. And this trauma is systemic, and it manifests itself in broken connections with colleagues, with leadership, and broken connections with the purpose and passion of an organization as a whole. So we're going to talk about some of the causes of this organizational trauma. As I said, you have organizations that are traumatized by single catastrophic events. So a single acutely destructive event like leadership embezzlement, like widespread layoffs, for instance, the loss of a large grant, like workplace violence, serious injury, death, or a natural disaster. So for instance, a staff member committing suicide, a resident dying while in shelter, a staff member being assaulted by a client, a staff member being accused of sexual violence, an act of weather like a tornado destroying all or part of a shelter. All of these things are sudden and acute destructive events that impact not only those individuals that experience the event directly, but they have kind of a ripple effect that radiates out throughout the organization to all of the staff members and even to close community partners, board members, supporters in the community when you have a catastrophic event like this. And so these catastrophic events, thankfully, are the least common form of organizational trauma, but they are very pervasive and difficult to move past if they're not addressed properly. The second thing that we talked about when we defined organizational trauma was this idea of ongoing harms or ongoing cumulative stressors. And these things are relatively more subtle than those acute events that we just talked about. These are things like increased demands for productivity and larger workloads that ignore existing tasks, lack of personal development and training for staff, inadequate time for supervision and collaboration, staff turnover that leads to things like loss of friendship patterns, loss of peer support, loss of organizational memory, a director who routinely verbally berates and belittles staff, staff members who bully each other, lack of transparency about important organizational issues that leave staff feeling frustrated and insecure, hostile relationships with the community. So often in particularly mission-driven organizations, depending on where the organization is located and what kind of the climate of the community is, you may have a community that's very supportive, or you may have a community that feels very negatively toward your mission, and that can leave an organization feeling like they're constantly under attack. They constantly have to be vigilant. They're constantly worried about things happening from the outside in. And so although none of these things may erupt in a large traumatic event per se, the cumulative effect over time is what's causing this traumatization of the organization. Feelings of helplessness grow over time and they compound over time. And often organizations who are experiencing ongoing harm are experiencing it from multiple sources. So you have staff turnover and larger workloads and bullying, multiple things happening at once that are impacting the whole. And so the third branch then, or the third source of organizational trauma, is the nature of trauma work, the nature of victim services and caregiving organizations themselves. And so this is the cumulative effect of secondary trauma over time. So as I'm sure that most of you know, secondary traumatic stress affects caregivers who work with victims or survivors in emotional pain, and they sort of soak up that pain. You know, our job is to be empathetic, and part of using empathy is opening ourselves up to absorbing the pain and absorbing the trauma of others. And so the nature of the work means that direct care staff are constantly absorbing stories of pain and trauma, which results in secondary traumatization, which is normal among direct care staff members like advocates, therapists, mental health professionals. But the problem is when it's widespread and untreated within an organization, and then while it originates with direct care staff, it will inevitably spread throughout the organization as stories of survivors are shared, as staff attempts to process what they've absorbed, as they interact with and communicate with other staff members who may not do direct services work, but who are still hearing the stories, hearing the trauma, and then we're spreading that secondary traumatization to them as well. And so because of the empathic nature of our work, anti-violence organizations like rape crisis centers, like domestic violence programs, are at particular risk for this because our daily work is so intense and we often don't have protections built into our organization to help us mitigate the secondary trauma that we're experiencing. And if that sort of preventative self-care is not built into our organizational structure, then we are putting ourselves in the position of having an organization that that is experiencing trauma at a high enough degree to call the entire organization traumatized, and we're not mitigating or treating that as we should be. And the other part of that is you can see from this little graph that I have inserted here, this type of anti-violence work attracts individuals who are passionate about the work, and the organizational culture itself, the mission of the organization, creates a certain intensity and a certain feeling within staff members of they need to be doing more and more and more to help clients and serve survivors. And the work itself is already difficult and intense and challenging. And so this is kind of the perfect storm for a traumatized organization, is to have staff feeding into organizational culture, which feeds into this intense work environment and creates an environment where we feel like we have to be constantly helping and constantly interacting and constantly dealing with trauma, and we are not encouraged to care for ourselves, or caring for ourselves is seen as time wasted that could be spent working with survivors. So oftentimes this field sort of creates an idea that self-care is discouraged because we should be caring for others instead. And so kind of the last thing that I want to say about, let me go back here, I kind of skipped ahead too quickly. The last thing I want to say about this sort of secondary traumatic stress is that a lot of the symptoms that you're going to see in advocates, in caregivers, are going to match the same symptoms of traumatic stress that you see in the survivors you treat. So you're going to see sort of parallel processes between the staff and the survivors in terms of the way stress is manifesting and the symptoms that you're seeing. And so if staff have an opportunity to process the trauma, to work through the trauma, to take care of themselves, then organizations can sort of integrate the experience into their daily function, and they can grow from the experience and learn from the experience without being disabled by them. But if, like I said, if your organization is not giving opportunities for self-care, if you're not an organization that encourages that or encourages processing, encourages staff to take care of itself, if they're unable to process the trauma, then it's going to cause that sense of stuckness that we talked about earlier, that sense that no one's moving forward, that disconnection. And so this branch, this type of organizational trauma from secondary stress is both the most common type of organizational trauma that presents in direct service agencies, and it's the easiest type to prevent. And we're going to talk about that more in the next couple of webinars in this series, but because every advocate, every person who does direct services with traumatized individuals, whether it's in mental health or homelessness work or as an ER nurse or whatever it is, every one of those individuals experiences vicarious trauma or secondary stress to a degree. And so it's incredibly common. And as I said, if you're not building in self-care, you're going to have it kind of snowball within your organization. But it's easy to prevent by building in self-care. So we're going to walk you through some of the symptoms of trauma, some of the things that you'll see within a traumatized organization. So signs and symptoms that your organization is experiencing trauma from one or more of the sources that we've talked about. But before we get to that, does anybody have any questions about the sources of trauma and what we've discussed so far? If you do have questions, just as I said, feel free to put them into the chat box. Someone did ask what is the name of our YouTube channel where the recording of this webinar will be, and it is TN Coalition. So if you search TN Coalition on YouTube, you will find our channel. All right, it looks like there's no questions right now, but as I said, if you do think of questions or have questions or concerns, just put them in the chat box as we go forward. So, signs and symptoms of this trauma. So, when an organization feels stuck, or when trauma is ongoing and cyclical, and it feels sort of never-ending, like we talked about, ongoing stresses and cumulative stress over time, it is easy for staff to feel trapped by either their financial situation or their love for and their obligation to the work and to the people that they serve. Both of those things can keep a staff member from leaving for a while, and it can keep them feeling more and more stuck in a traumatic situation. And so I mentioned earlier that unexpected turnover can be a source of trauma, and unexpected turnover is often incredibly symptomatic of organizational trauma, and it seems counterintuitive. So when I say staff often feel like they're stuck and they have no escape because of either financial situation or lack of other work in the community, or like I said, that love for and obligation to the work that they're doing, saying that unexpected turnover is a symptom seems kind of counterintuitive to that. But the reality is staff tend to feel trapped and they tend to hang on until they reach a breaking point. And that's why turnover not only seems pervasive and almost constant, it's often really unexpected, because once that staff member reaches a breaking point, they tend to leave very suddenly. So you don't have people who are saying, you know, I've been looking for a while and I found this great place, or somebody reached out for me. It always seems like it's a sudden departure. And so then you have unexpected turnover and you have staff who are leaving. And so the staff who stay, along with the trapped feeling that they already have, along with existent trauma, now they have the need to shoulder the burden of the responsibilities of the staff who've left. And so now they have that stuck feeling, that trapped feeling, the trauma that they have as part of a traumatized organization, and now additional responsibilities, additional burden to pick up the slack. And this can result in low energy. It can result in situational depression among the staff members who stay behind or have been left behind. And high stress often makes people sort of hyper-focus on their own emotional state and on their own safety, which makes it really difficult to perform well in their day-to-day work responsibilities. The American Psychological Association estimates that job stress in the form of absenteeism, healthcare costs, and productivity loss costs the United States about $300 billion, with a B, dollars per year. So this is a huge and pervasive issue that when someone feels trapped and feels stressed and feels overburdened, their work is going to suffer across the board. And then more burden falls onto other staff, and it, as I was saying earlier, it's a very cyclical process, and it sort of feeds into itself, especially if there's nothing done to mitigate the stress or nothing done to address the underlying issues. I think this is an important quote. Just as the lives of people exposed to repetitive and chronic trauma, abuse, and maltreatment become organized around the trauma, so too can entire systems become organized around recurrent and severe stress. As a result, complex interactions often occur between staff, administrators, and organizations as a whole. And so they replicate experiences that are toxic in both their interactions with other staff and their interactions with clients. So what I'm really talking about here, and what I think is important to understand, is that traumatized and chronically stressed organizations do not only negatively impact the staff of those organizations, but you're also seeing a negative impact to the clients that you serve. In these chronically stressed organizations, staff members, many of whom you have to remember, many advocates and people working in this field, have their own histories of trauma and abuse. They may not feel safe to talk to management, to talk to other staff. And at a certain point, they become so overwhelmed that they feel like they can't continue absorbing trauma and being empathetic to their clients because they have no more empathy left to give. And so then they start avoiding client interactions, avoiding interactions with management and leadership, avoiding interactions with other staff. So connections are breaking down. We're seeing clients who are getting less staff interaction, less treatment. Staff are chronically frustrated, they're angry, they may be venting their feelings to clients, and their frustrations and worry and anger a lot of time emerges as more and more punitive measures and reactionary rules created within the program. So we're talking about strict rules created to prevent unique situations. Like, for instance, you may have a client who returns to shelter one night who is drunk and belligerent and, you know, threatens or behaves violently towards staff, and that may result, instead of dealing with that one particular client and then letting it go and understanding that that's a rare situation, it may result in an unreasonable curfew for every client. You know, everyone has to be in the shelter by 7 p.m. at night. And it may result in things like expulsion from shelter for any client who may be suspected of drinking outside shelter. So these are reactionary rules and punitive measures that affect everyone that arise out of a single stressful event. And really impact our ability to provide trauma-informed services. In cases of severely traumatized agencies, uncertainty and threats seem to originate from both clients and the organizational system and leadership, which creates this chronic level of anxiety and hyperarousal in staff. So they're always sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. So every time they're called into a supervisor's office to talk about something that may be, you know, just a check-in, just positive, just normal, they feel like they're kind of walking to the chopping block and they don't know what's going to happen, and they get a lot of anxiety around that. Every time they have to interact with a client, they're expecting the worst. Every time they have to interact with leadership, they're expecting the worst. So you get someone who is constantly reactionary, constantly anxious, constantly on edge. Communication breaks down between staff members. Interpersonal conflicts increase and they're not resolved. You have a lot of infighting between staff members that can go on and on and on. And team functioning becomes really fragmented because it becomes this idea of self-protection, and I have to take care of me, and, you know, nobody else is looking out for me, so I can't interact and work with you in a collaborative way because I'm too busy thinking what's going to happen next, when is the other shoe going to drop. And as all this is happening, staff members are likely to feel overwhelmed, confused, depressed, emotionally exhausted, cynical, and they lose kind of their effectiveness in the work. They start being less creative, less energized. They're, like I said, avoiding interacting with clients. And all of this is a road straight to burnout. So you're having more burnout, more staff turnover, less positive interactions with clients. So the overall success of the agency is plummeting because we're not addressing these internal traumas and these internal issues. So the next sort of symptom or piece of this puzzle is resistance to change, or going to the other extreme and having really anxiety-based or reactionary changes happening. So organizations that are resistant to change, staff members are frequently caught between the demands of the system and the needs of the client, and organizations become crisis-oriented, so they're completely focused on getting through the present, dealing with whatever today's crisis is. and they lack energy and enthusiasm to plan for the future. Demoralization among staff escalates because the crisis just seems never ending, and therefore there's no progress and there's no positive change happening. In a traumatized organization, oftentimes rumors are how information spreads, and so rumors run rampant and take the place of actual official communication, because the reality is organizations who are deeply traumatized are notoriously bad at communicating in times of crisis, which exacerbates the trauma, exacerbates the crisis. And silence from leadership lets imaginations run out of control, anxiety levels run high, and then more rumors happen, and it's sort of a never-ending cycle because, again, we're not doing what we need to do to address it and treat the underlying issues. So communication and transparency is lost, which continues this lack of trust. And when there is a lack of trust, even when change and progress is proposed, there's going to be resistance. We don't trust you to be making appropriate decisions and well thought out decisions. We haven't been part of the conversation about these decisions. We've heard crazy rumors about these decisions. So even when we're proposing change, staff are going to be resistant to it. And workers feel powerless because they feel like either on one hand, nothing is changing, nothing is getting better, nothing is getting addressed, and on the other hand, the things that are being proposed, the changes that are happening, seem arbitrary and scary, and so we are not trusting that leadership has the best interests of staff at heart. So this lack of communication really fuels so much continued trauma. And I really cannot stress that enough, that such a huge key, and we'll, like as I said, we'll talk about this more in our next couple of sessions in this series, but such a huge key to healing trauma is communication, and that's a big part of what a lack of communication allows trauma to continue. And so the last point I want to make in terms of resistance to change is oftentimes chronically stressed, chronically traumatized organizations also have sort of this culture of chronic discouragement. We discourage staff creativity, we discourage new ideas, we fear or mistrust trying something new because we're in an environment that feels so crisis-oriented and so fragile that we want to keep things the same because there's this feeling that what we've always done is safe. And that really stifles growth and makes staff feel unvalued and unheard and prevents positive change from happening. So then, as I said, sort of the other end of this change spectrum is really anxiety-based decision-making and reactionary change. So many chronically stressed organizations engage in really faulty and inadequate problem solving under stress. We either revert to the old ways of doing things, even if the old ways don't work, as I said, because of that idea of we know how to do this and it's sort of a protective measure, or we're making really kind of seat of our pants decisions in the face of crisis as a reaction to crisis without slowing down and taking time to think through the decisions that we're making for the organization as a whole. Organizations that are making sort of these reactionary changes begin to look more and more fragmented, as the right hand knows less and less about what the left hand is doing. So again, rumors are running rampant because leadership are making decisions over here and advocates are doing their best that they can to keep working through trauma over here, and nobody is coming together to communicate. And turnover causes loss of institutional memory, so we're repeating past mistakes. And this causes thought processes and decision-making processes to become oversimplified, extremist, and reactive. Both individual and group decision-making become progressively compromised because there's a constant feeling of having to make an immediate decision in crisis, and there's no time to make thoughtful, thought-out decisions. And then we have rigidity, lack of flexibility and creativity. Stressed organizations frequently respond to fear of impending chaos and crisis by becoming more and more structured, by putting more and more rules in place and more boundaries in place, which can increase in these types of structure and these types of reactionary rules leads a lot of times to a system that is very rigid, it's inflexible, and rulemaking and rule enforcement becomes the focus instead of collaboration and team building and decision making. It's this idea that if we follow and abide by all of these rules we've created in response to this crisis, and we make sure that everyone sort of stays in line and does everything by the book and follows everything by the letter of these rules, that we can get through this and that things are going to be okay. And it's how we respond to crisis as humans is by trying to organize more and more rigidly. But when that happens, we're not collaborating, we're not discussing in practical terms what is working, what is not working. We're not hearing feedback and we're not using feedback. And a lot of this, it comes from leadership attempting to correct problems by exercising more and more control. And in true times of crisis, in times of acute and unexpected crisis, control can be extremely helpful. The group may pull together and respond to the direction of a single leader who is in charge and move past a sudden crisis really effectively. But when you have an environment that's chronically stressed, chronically traumatized, chronically crisis-driven and crisis-focused, then controlling behavior continues indefinitely and begins to alienate staff, decreases collaboration and creativity and problem solving, prevents us from thinking about true solutions to mitigate the crisis that's happening, and causes a lot of frustration and a lot of anger over time. So another risk in these chronically stressed organizations is that connections are broken on multiple levels. So collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it. So it does not have the quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma, but it is a form of shock all the same, a gradual realization that the community no longer exists as an effective source of support and that an important part of self has disappeared. So when you have that chronic trauma over time, it drives wedges between staff and leadership, wedges between team members and peers, wedges between staff and community members that breaks connection. So it's this chronic stress that we've been talking about, the lack of communication that we've been talking about, reactionary changes, all of these pieces of the puzzle work together to erode trust among people within the organization and erode trust toward the organization as a whole. And so the result of this is that there's no collaboration between different divisions of an organization. There's no collaboration between peers. There's certainly no collaboration between staff and clients. And we lose our connection to community partners because we're trying to sort of circle the wagons internally to contain the stress, to deal with the crisis, and we're not taking time to reach out to our community partners and others to maintain those outside connections. And the other reality of chronic stress and organizational trauma is that organizational trauma and traumatic events are highly polarizing, and they can rupture even long-standing good relationships, particularly relationships between staff and leadership are really fragile in times of trauma, because when people feel like there's a lack of trust, when people feel like there's a lack of communication, there's a lack of responsiveness, and that nothing is being done to address the trauma and the stress that's happening, people align with those who they perceive to be in similar circumstances. So staff will align with each other, and they'll put up barriers against anyone that they feel may be a threat on multiple levels. So that typically makes itself known by seeing sort of staff and leadership being pitted against each other and not communicating and not trusting, different factions of staff, maybe shelter staff pitted against outreach staff. You see people dividing sort of up into factions. Again, you're not collaborating with clients and survivors. So all of these connections, both internal and external, are broken. And then, finally, but maybe most importantly, this chronic stress and chronic trauma within an organizational system causes a loss of meaning and demoralization towards the work that you do. Staff become progressively hopeless and helpless about the work they're doing. They stop being able to see the possibility of change. And chronically traumatized and chronically stressed organizations are typically controlled top to bottom by people who are experiencing symptoms of burnout. They're emotionally exhausted, they're cynical about their clients, they're lacking a sense of achievement personally and professionally. And this causes people to really lose sight of the mission of their work and of the reason why we do what we do. And so they derive less and less satisfaction from the work over time. This presents as loss of vision, loss of purpose, and people become cynical about their clients and about clients being able to heal and about systems being able to change and about, education and all of these things that we work for in terms of social change. People start losing hope that change is possible. So here are some resources. If you will look on your webinar toolbar that's on the right side of your screen, you'll see a little tab that says Handouts. And under that Handouts tab, you will find a sheet that has all of these resources on it. You can download the resource sheet. You can have all of this additional reading. You will also, under that Handout tab, find your certificate of attendance for today. So just to kind of wrap up and review, and while I'm doing our wrap up, if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please go ahead and put them in your chat or question box, and I'll go ahead and start answering any questions that have come up, because I know we've gone over a lot of stuff in this first session. So to review, if exposure to chronic stress or trauma creates an atmosphere of crisis within an organization. Organizations often fail to involve staff in decision-making processes. They often fail to thoughtfully and constructively confront problems and fail to communicate effectively. This atmosphere of chronic stress and chronic crisis contributes to poor client services. Organizations become crisis-driven and reactive instead of thoughtful. And trauma can affect organizations and manifest within organizations just as it affects individuals, families, and communities. So we really have to think from a standpoint of trauma workers like we do every day when we work with clients, and think about the way trauma has affected their day-to-day lives and what they need to be empowered from and heal from that trauma. We have to take those same systems of needs assessment and evaluation and turn those systems and those assessments and those eyes and that understanding of trauma toward our organization. Understanding sources of organizational trauma really highlights the need for not only organizational self-care, but organizational self-knowledge. As we think about the strengths within our organization, the resources within our organization, the creativity within our organization, we can start to assess and strategize ways to move past trauma and heal from trauma instead of just reacting to trauma. And again, in our next session, we are going to be talking about how to start healing organizations that have experienced trauma and those ways that we can start healing crisis and healing trauma and coming back to a healthy organization. So for anyone who came in a little late and may have missed the beginning of the presentation, I will let you know that this webinar was recorded probably this afternoon, if not tomorrow morning. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and our YouTube channel is TN Coalition. And again, if you would like to sign up for any of the other sessions in our February webinar series, you can find those on our website at tncoalition.org/calendar. And if you would like the handout of resources for today, and if you need a certificate of attendance for today, as I said, you will find that in the handout tab on your webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. You can just click on the names of those resources in order to download them. So make sure that you take the time before you sign off today to get your certificate, to get the resource handout if you need that. And again, does anyone have any questions about anything we've gone over? If you do have a question, go ahead and type it out in your chat box or your question box, and I will see that and answer it. All right, I'm going to give a minute or two for anybody to ask questions if they have questions, and for everyone to download their certificates if they need them. But otherwise, I want to thank you so much for attending the webinar today. When you exit out of the webinar, an evaluation will pop up, and we just ask you to take a minute or two and fill out the webinar evaluation so that we have that feedback as we are creating more trainings in the future. And again, thank you so much for attending. And like I said, I'll be here for about 5 more minutes for anybody who does have questions and needs to download their certificate. So go ahead and do that. If you have a question that you would like answered privately, my email is on the screen there, so please do feel free to email me and let me know if you need any guidance or resources or have any other questions. And again, thank you so much for attending today.